Hello everyone, welcome to this fifth talk in the algorithmic pattern series. So before I introduce Sarah, I'll just say a little bit about the series. It's exploring the connection between algorithms and patterns, or rather it's looking at algorithms as patterns and patterns as algorithms in various crafts and art forms, including weaving, wire bending, heritage algorithms. Let's have a look. Oh yeah, the next one will be about juggling. But I suppose we're used to algorithmic art as being discussed in the context of computer art, and which we haven't talked about too much up to now. Like the first talk by Laura Devendorf on weaving was actually introducing her system and programming language AdaCAD for exploring weaving patterns. But today we're really stepping much more into the world of computer art in the context of Sarah's work. So Sarah is a live coder, a software artist, as we used to call people making art with software. I'm not sure if we still do. And designer, programmer, who has really been influential in the live coding scene, especially the visual side, where she has done some amazing performances as part of Cody and worked with her own system Algebra, which I think she'll talk about, and also written some really nice short essays, which I really encourage you to have a look at. I think we've linked to them from the algorithmicpattern.org website about critical computer art. So that's some of the things we'll be talking about today. I'm mainly just talking to warm up the stream, and I think it's getting nice and warm now. So I think I'll introduce, just need to press a few buttons, right. Yeah, amazing, magic. Sarah, how are you doing?
Hi, Alex. I'm good. How are you?
I'm all right. Yeah, not too bad at all. Excited to talk to you. So, so would you like to speak for a bit about your work, maybe? Introduce yourself, and so I'll leave you to it and join for some discussion in a bit. Feel free to ask questions in the YouTube comments, and we'll get to them during the discussion. Here we go.
Hi, everyone. So, like Alex said, I'm a software engineer by day, and I think I call it media artist, video artist by night. There's so many different words to use, but my practice sort of centers around making art with the computer, but in a way that goes against what I would consider the grain of our current software culture. So, whereas things now might be focused on sort of novelty and the idea of the computer as being objective, I'm far more interested in looking at the ways that computing and computer art can be historically situated. And then likewise, I would say, while software culture focuses a lot on the categorical and sort of looking for patterns in a way that reifies its like control focused structures. I'm interested in what we can do that's unstructured and involves relating with the computer in a different way. All of which is sort of a way to say that I'm interested in working in ways that are a little bit looser and more improvisational. And I'm particularly interested in doing this in a way that's sort of a more aesthetic and procedural investigation, as opposed to some more didactic approaches. And so all of that together has led to me looking at live code, and then after that into video processing. Live code sort of lets me explore software for different goals, right? Like when you write code for work all day, your goals are sort of things that help businesses make money. And when you write software for making live code art in particular, you're less interested in something being ultimately perfectible over a long period of time, and more interested in how do you write software in a way that lets you make interesting stuff now, even when you make mistakes. And so those are sort of some of the concepts that I was interested in when I worked on Algebra and that I was focused on. And so both creating the software has been a way for me to investigate these software ideas conceptually. And then, of course, there's the experience of live coding itself. Live coding itself, which is a way to relate to the computer differently. And from there, I've moved into video art, which is another way of thinking about signals, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, but more thinking about signals as a continuum instead of binary. And that also sort of lets me look at different historical ways that people have represented information in images. So that is the short thing about me and what I do. And so now I'm just going to do a little demo of Algebra for everyone. So this is software I wrote. It's written in ClojureScript, and it uses web technologies to basically draw pictures with SVGs. And so I just need to share the screen with everyone, and then I can show you how that works. I think it's sharing. Alex, do you need to pop it up? Perfect. So on the left, we have the representation there, which is where all the pictures are going to go. And then on the right, this is the code. It's a little bit small. Maybe we can make it a little bit bigger for folks. And so essentially the way it works is when I play with Kodi, we don't align our music using OSC signals or anything like that. We just pick the same timer and go with it. And so the base of this is a timer system that lets you draw things and make them disappear according to the timer. And so the base level of this is, and I'm commenting out stuff so you guys don't have to watch me draw everything right now in real life, but I can generate this rectangle, which is nice. It takes a bunch of little parameters, and you can see, and important in terms of patterns actually, and the way it works with the music is we have this little line here that shows us the nth frame, third frame, which is to say this rectangle will appear on the third frame. And to go with the patterns that we're working with, what sort of makes, I think, Algebra work compelling is the way that out of very simple patterns, you can start to build fairly complex visuals. So now we have 2 frames. They're showing one on the third, one on the fourth. This works really nicely. I left a comment for myself to make a grid for texture. So one thing that's nice about Algebra is I was able to build in various text shortcuts because I want the code to be verbose enough that even if you're not a dev, you can probably read a little bit about what's going on. But I don't want to have to remember how to type it all. So I was able to use Atom has a really nice way to write shortcuts so that I can go ahead and remind myself of how everything needs to work. So I know how many columns and rows I want in my various offsets, which is nice. Tragically, actually, Atom is being sunset, and all of the, well, not all of them, but most of the other editors that are available do not have such easy plugin systems, which is a real tragedy. So then we use this when. We're going to let this show up, let's say, every 6th frame. I think that'll work, and if not, we'll see how the error handling works. Oh yeah, so you can see I made an error. I think there's an extra paren there. Usually there's music to distract you while I'm making my errors, but that's okay. All right, so now we have our grid going. So now we have like a nice background. And then we might want to add some figures. So we can add our cool orange circle also showing up. So in this case, it's that when not, so you can see the 6th frame. Can add in some more cool groups I've created. So now we've got some rectangles. They're all very cool. If we decide we want some of the rectangles to have a pattern, we can do that as well. So I put the code up here so you don't have type, but we can replace the color in each of these with a pattern reference. And then now all of the second rectangles will have a pattern fill instead, or I can just break everything. That's also cool. I think it just needs a second paren. I love life coding. One more. Woohoo! So now we have all our different patterns. And they look very cool. We have a foreground and a background, but of course we also might want some animations. So there's a different series of animations. We have some more subtle ones here with, again, the patterns going on and looking at their interactions. And we can have some fun little scribbles. Here we go. And so in a typical live code performance, right, obviously this will be built up over more time and go with the music. But it's not just that you can have one pattern in the Algebra now. So this is sort of one SVG grouping that shows you how everything works. But I actually have made it now so that you can have lots of different lists of SVGs. So I have made a bunch of preset lists already, 5 of them. And so now you have another element to the pattern, right, which is the cycling of different SVG views. And that'll go through and you can sort of see how the different elements can combine to give interesting but somewhat different effects. I think still characteristic, but not always the same. And then from here, I have moved into, oh, we almost forgot an important part. There's a second SVG that sits on top of all of them. And so if one wanted to create elements that are consistent through all of the different SVG backgrounds going through, in this case, we have those falling dots and the sort of breathing circles. And so in this case, because the lists I've chosen are sort of for a wide variety, seems a little silly to have the one thing connecting them, but it's a way that you can start to create a number of different levels of pattern frame by frame and yet connect them all together. And from here, I've started bringing these into different video synthesizers and emulators. So anything from VDMX, which uses like shaders that you can put on top of things, into running it into hardware synthesizers like the Fairlight CVI, which is a video synth from the 1990s. And then that process, so then you have sort of the patterns that are within the elements creating the compositions, but you also can then start creating new and different patterns by the way that I pass the images through different synthesizers, and that sort of creates almost a pattern of time or a pattern of history. But I think we want to talk about questions, so I'm going to stop here. But if you're interested, all over the internet, I have various things so you can see what it starts looking like into further video transformations. I can't hear you. You're muted, Alex.
Yeah. So sorry about that. You missed me enthusing about how amazing this is. So yeah, I love it. So there's a lot going on here. I love the different layering and the way you talk about patterns happening on different levels. It reminds me of Manjinath BC talking in the last talk about how where complexity comes from, and as a creator you aren't necessarily dealing with complexity yourself because everything's so simple. The complexity is for the audience. Like when I look at this video, it's extremely complex, but then it's this kind of multi-layered combination of different elements where each element is by itself very simple and coherent, and what you're experiencing in the end is the combination of them, which is something new that sort of emerges from them. Is that kind of a point of view that you would share, do you think?
Yeah, I think very much so. I recently played a show where I did a talk and then I did the performance, and somebody came up to me and was like, when you did the talk, it all seemed like it was going to be so simple and boring, but then you did it and it wasn't boring. And I was like, well, yes, because the combination is the emergent space for interesting things to happen. And, and it's really nice because like having some simple consistencies, the same animations are available to them so that even if it's different elements, they're moving in the same path. Or, the constrained color palette makes it possible to have a connection in the complexity, right? So it doesn't turn into chaos. You're not just throwing everything into one bucket, but you create the environment for interesting patterns to emerge that are sensical or like fun.
But somehow it feels like it's sort of surfing on the boundary between chaos and order. It's like navigating. It's almost like when you have all these different elements and you're combining them in different ways. Sometimes I think it feels like making your own random number generator, but one where you're just kind of dialing that chaos up and down and finding that sweet spot in between where things are happening, where it feels alive.
Maybe it's like your own Perlin noise generator rather than like a random number one, right? Because like when you do art where it's totally random, it can be hard to approach it because there's no sense in it at all. But like, right, Perlin noise is cool because it's noise that has features we expect from noise, which are like some of the continuities and stuff. And so it's a way of trying to do that visually. And in this case, rather than like having spatial continuity, you have animation continuity and other aesthetic continuities that can bring sense in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think because we're both sort of from the live coding community, we can easily kind of geek out with these things. Maybe we should sort of explain ourselves a bit more, in case there's people in the audience who have no idea what we're talking about. So yeah, I guess by live coding, we're both into this scene. I'm only really on the music side, and you're, I think, only really on the video side, although we collaborate across these boundaries. So yeah, live coding. What is it? And what is the liveness in live coding? Because it's almost a contradiction in terms. We think about liveness, think of something as being really direct and sort of present, but yet code almost distances you from something because it's like it's a mediation between you and what you're making. You write code to make visuals. You're not drawing the visuals by hand. So where is this liveness, and where do you see the role of the code in that?
So I think I always think of liveness as the possibility for everything to go to shit. Like it's live because you could make a terrible error. Or I've played shows where, with somebody who's a reasonably well-known live coder, where his computer broke for like 10 minutes in the middle of the last show, and it was just like, yep, it's live code, which is nice because I think the environment of the shows where everybody knows that you're doing it live and that it's not pre-planned, and it means that things can go wrong, makes such like a good audience because everyone's sort of willing to come along with you for whatever that adventure is. Like I think my worst shows are maybe the ones I've over prepared for. Like you kind of have to go in with a sense of adventure. And in that case, I feel like the code maybe isn't that distant because I'm still typing it into the computer at the moment that it's happening. And I really like writing code. Like, I think I'm really critical of software culture because I like software. And I'm like, why is this thing I love been captured by like this thing I hate?
Yeah.
And so to me, it feels almost as natural as drawing or swimming or doing anything that like you do all the time. So it doesn't feel distant, even though I guess I can see how it might.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I'm with you there. It's kind of, programming is kind of my main way of interacting with the outside world, I think. But you have to kind of, you have to see it as part of, as something that's the result of software engineering, which is invented during the Cold War as a kind of military tactic almost to make software better so that we can win the war or whatever. And I think that those kind of military underpinnings are still in the way we see software engineering as being hierarchical, as being, as you say, a technology of control, and this idea of quality assurance, something should be defined very clearly about what's going to happen, and yet we're trying to use this technology that's made for I don't know, calculating trajectories of missiles to make art. So that there's a way in which we're completely sold into this world of software, but at the same time kind of aware of this slightly dark underpinning for it. How do you kind of respond to the history of computing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Because on the one hand, in some ways, I feel like computing is objective, which is a weird thing for me to say because in general, people like to be like, this AI system is going to be objective and it's going to tell us the truth. And I'm like, well, that's obviously bullshit. But fundamentally, I don't think that just because computing was invented for missiles, that's what it's only good for or has to be good for. And so I feel like using it for non-productive things is like making it better. Like we're rescuing it from its terrible birth.
Yeah.
So I think that's how I think about the history or the way that people can use it for ill is I'm like, I think computing can mostly be rescued by never using it to do anything practical.
Yeah. And I think there's also a way in which you can kind of challenge that history and the way it's told. There's all kinds of histories we can map out, like history of computing is something that people do, not just that we've always done through counting and mathematics and also craft, things like computing and weaving and things like this, which we just do with our hands. But yeah, I guess there is, as computing is presented to us as something that is done by electronic computer, we do have to kind of, there's no reason why it can't be used for art, of course. And I think actually there's other art forms like dance often refers to Laban, who developed choreographic notations, but did that. He was employed by Hitler to create fascist artwork. So there's always these kind of underpinnings of history that we need to challenge, but that doesn't mean that we just stop making art, right?
Well, and something I think that is really important about live code in terms of computing is like a technology of control is that part of the way the control works is by mystifying the computing, right? This idea that like programmers are this high caste of mathematicians who understand problems that no one else could understand.
Yeah.
And live code really does help demystify that, both by making the code sort of legible by tying it to sounds or visuals so that audience members can sort of see what's going on and it becomes more transparent. But it also helps people undermine, I think, by letting practitioners feel empowered to make their own tools. Like, I think we both sort of know there's the joke that, like, you're not a real live code visualist until you've built your own visuals tool. Whether it's like me or Guy or Antonio or Olivia Jack, like a lot of live code visualists bottom out and being like, I built my own tool. And so I think that as a community, it also encourages people to demystify computing by saying, like, you can totally build your own thing. And if an idiot like me did it, you can definitely do it too.
Yeah, absolutely. And even if you're not making your own tool, you're still kind of working out where in this huge language you're going to live. Because in any live coding language, there's so many different combinations and so many features that you just pick a few and you can find out your own little place within that. So yours kind of defining your own constraints in that way, which is nice. But I feel like I'm drawing from a lot of your manifesto points. So maybe, if you don't mind, I could actually just share the manifesto itself, and we could like talk a little bit about that. So is this like a new version of it, the Principles of Fuzzy Art?
Yeah, this is sort of B2 of the manifesto. Um, and so I started calling it fuzzy art partially to distinguish it from glitch art, where people are like, oh, you push the computer to its edge, or like I was saying before, you might use different emulators and systems. And so as you like upsample and downsample and rescan something analog, you like start picking up this fuzz. And it's not a glitch. It's not, you're doing it wrong. You're not breaking things. You're just sort of using a system to make the constraints of the system apparent by moving through different systems, and so it like accumulates this. And so that's why I sort of moved into fuzzy art, that I felt like was a little bit more descriptive of the aesthetic, that might be different from like critical computer art, which could look like anything. Like fuzzy art is my version of computer critical art, if that makes sense.
Okay. But yeah, I guess this is the first point, which I think we've kind of been leading up to, which is nice to have it as the first point here. So the on the left, I think this is the range between two values, and on the right, which is crossed out, is either or, I think. Correct me if my mathematical reading of this is incorrect.
No, that's right. This is probably like the mathiest I get.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, the first principle is focusing on the range versus the binary. And that's something I've come around to by working with video art, because the way a video signal works, right, is it is a continuum between 0 and 1. There's more complication also in the signal. There's things outside of that that communicate where to draw the line and when to go back to the top when you're drawing a video frame. But essentially, because video signals are a range, you can do like a lot of different interesting playing with it. And it's hard to break something that's a range because it's not on off either or. You can sort of explain or explore the contours. And so I try to think about what that means in a bigger system of computing and computing art, right? So a way to think about it is that people are really into static typing, which is funny because I know title your tool is written in Haskell, but people are very into static typing. And I feel like a lot of that is trying to confine the edges of things so that you can predict what's going to happen. And it's like, but instead of locking things out or making things categorical to make them work, how do we make something flexible so that it continues to work without being on off? And so that would be the first point, is like to explore the concept of what the range would mean in terms of software. And so even in Algebra, that's things like when I make an error, it doesn't stop working, right? It just keeps working at whatever was the last side. And so, yeah, that's the first point.
Yeah, I think this is pretty fundamental to computer art, because it's often called digital art, and the idea that there's the digital world and the real world, and we somehow enter this digital world and we're all digital then. But actually computers, they are using a computer as a continuous experience as much as a digital one. When we draw a circle on the screen, that's what we see. It's irrelevant that deep down in a microprocessor everything is just down to binary switches. We describe continuous functions, and in any discrete digital system, you just use it to create a continuous one, and in a continuous world you can create a digital one. And so it's just like this layering, this lasagna of analog and digital experience. They support each other, if we just treat computers as just a bunch of switches, I think that's a bit of a shame. But that's what we do all the time when we speak about them. So yeah, I think it's really nice to clean up this misunderstanding. And yeah, in all kinds of ways of being human, we're ranges, and it's nice to think about our computers in the same way, I think.
Yes, and I think it's important to always be focused on being able to represent a range, because a lot of the harms that do come out of what we're seeing people using computing for now, especially algorithmic and other sort of predictive systems that rely on probability, they do sort of create a fundamental violence at the end of the day when they put someone in a category that can't be reflective of the truth of the matter. And so sort of trying to keep the ability to represent multiplicity in the forefront, I think is important in working with computing.
Yeah. And how things can change over time as well, continuously. So yeah, let's have a look. Making history visible. So we've kind of talked a bit about history already. So is this about problematic aspects of history, or is it also less problematic aspects?
I think it's both. I'm more interested in the idea than judging that history, because I think what the judgment is fairly apparent, than in keeping the idea that computing didn't like spring fully form like some scientific system, right? Computing isn't gravity, and even gravity is not gravity, but it's not like a very obvious scientific system where it's a law of nature and it has just been discovered. It's that it's something that has been constructed over time by people, and people have made choices for different reasons. And I think making sure we're also considering that is important. And in my case, I've done it very aesthetically. Like we were talking about before, that's more for me like accreting weird, fuzzy pieces in my work. And somebody else might take that and make something totally different, but I think it's a principle worth holding.
Okay, let's have a look. Okay, yeah, we've kind of already talked about this as well in the fuzziness, the kind of embracing error aspect of computer art. Is there anything more to say, do you think? Or
I think the thing I would say about this is I try to embrace error, like we were saying, by continuing going forward. And I've discovered really interesting things by doing that. So I have like this little animation that like makes a circle shake. And that was a mistake. It's like a broken animation where it's restarting the animation every frame instead of like continuously animating the same object. But it was great because like trying to write that effect would suck. Using like the using the mistake of my system to make this thing happen is great and easy. And so I really like to think about it in terms of that like perfection is a boring goal, but also you create more space to discover things if you explicitly try to keep moving forward even when it's not perfect.
Yeah. And I guess it's partly about kind of giving up the whole idea of perfection, approaching a work not with a perfect idea about what it's going to be, and then you're either disappointed with what you come up with or not based on whether it matches your original perfect idea. But rather just like using code as a material that you work with, that you try things out, see what happens, and respond to the results. So sometimes I think embracing error doesn't even involve errors. It's just kind of rejecting the idea of an error, treating errors as positive to the extent where they don't exist anymore.
Yeah, I read this really great book called, I think it's called On Error. That must be what it is. But she talks about how mistakes or errors are often the idea where what you can imagine and what the world are different. And in that way, like making a mistake is like a really wonderful thing because you have this imagination to see something that doesn't exist and like feeling like that was bad as opposed to amazing is unfortunate. And so I always think about that where I'm like, oh, I was wrong because I imagined something cool. Like, that's great.
Yeah, Jonathan Royce just wanted a clarification. What does it mean that it keeps working? You're talking about Algebra, how it keeps working when you make a mistake rather than stopping.
So it does that in two ways. Sometimes it ignores what I typed. So if you get like an error window at the bottom, the animation that was like the last functional state continues going. So nobody has to like look at a black screen. But because it's ClojureScript, which eventually turns into HTML, HTML is very flexible. It will sort of guess what you wanted. If you write HTML without like a bunch of closing tags or other things, it'll just guess. And so keeping working can also mean that it can mean writing a system where if you don't know the answer or the system doesn't know what the answer is, maybe you have good defaults or I think default is usually the way, but like, you're trying to keep things going if you don't have perfect information. And yeah.
Nice. Okay. So let's move on. Mind-to-mind communication. So what does this involve? Reading your work, this seems to partly involve repetition. I saw that word come up, which is a favourite word of mine.
Well, I think it's the idea of, that the goal of the work is to be able to communicate to people through the experience versus through the computer. And so, as I mentioned before, like Cody doesn't use computer-driven syncing. We don't do like audio reactive stuff. It's just that we're together and we know how to improvise together and we have a timer that's roughly the same, and the rest of the communication is through the people and not through the machine. And so I think that it's that same kind of like undermining or stepping away from computer culture or current like mainstream computer culture where you're not like the computer is perfect so it will drive everything. It's instead sharing the experience together, and the computer is just part of that as a material.
Yeah, I guess computers are just not good at synchronizing with people. People are really good at synchronizing with people. So that makes a lot of sense.
Well, and something funny that we found is that, if something is computer timed and is very slightly off, you'll notice, right? Because it's like off by the same amount every time. Or like if you're watching a video and the sound is slightly shifted and you can see that like it's not matching up with the lips.
Yeah.
But if it's less tightly connected, then people's brains make it work together. So people will watch Cody stuff and be like, how are you keeping all of that together? And it's like, I'm not. Your brain is. And because it's not consistently off, I think your brain doesn't pick up on that and be like, oh, it's consistently off. It's just like, oh, this is a little fuzzy. It's fine. It's like when you're like seasick, you get a little bit drunk and then you stop being seasick because your body is like, well, everything's moving, so I'm not going to freak out anymore. It's like that with computers.
Yeah. But then I guess that same thing's happening with you as a performer, because your kind of perception and brain is in the loop between the code and the visuals. You're looking at your visuals, responding by editing the code. So I guess you're also looking for these interplays between the sound and the visual, and working with that. But is that what you're communicating, or are you just creating a kind of space for other people to come up with their own interpretations?
I like to hope that I'm communicating the vibes that I'm putting into what I'm doing. I don't always know how successful it is. I think the way I know it's most successful is like when Cody plays together, we will definitely get a feedback loop of like sound vibe and visual vibe and be able to communicate that way. So I do think it is often communicating what I'm trying to communicate, which is usually mostly an experience, right? Like a couple summers ago, we would do rooftop shows and it was really hot. So we had like very summery experience. It's like less than a clear point. Like I'm very interested in sort of having these ideas about what I want to say about computing and then turning around and making these experiences. And I think these experiences have these principles behind them, but it's not really obvious because I don't think it works if it's too didactic, basically, that I want it to sort of be in the atmosphere. And I think if somebody continues to experience those things, they will also start to notice the ideas behind it.
Yeah, I think I'm still curious about the role of repetition in this. I just saw this in one version of your manifesto. And I guess another word for repetition is resonance, which kind of, when you're collaborating with other people, that's kind of what you're looking for, I suppose, and what you're describing is a kind of feedback loop between people where you're resonating, but then the repetition and the changing of the repetition becomes the kind of the place in which you're communicating, and also kind of in training together, kind of finding that shared rhythm and shared idea.
Yes, all of that. I should take that and write that in my next manifesto and take all of the credit for it.
Okay, let's look at the last point of the let the computer forget. So this is a nice one to end on, at least in these manifesto points. So yeah, but it kind of goes against what you were saying earlier about history. Forgetting is the kind of opposite of history in a way. So.
Well, history is like the material, and I think when I think about forgetting, I mean not hoarding data. So that's again like part of that undermining approach that I think a lot about, that like the idea is computers are great because they have infinite data and can find everything hidden inside of them. And I think as like an improvisational artist and a live coder, it can be really tempting to save every minute of what you did. Like you could like start recording and save all of that. And I think that like atmospherically, willfully not doing that is an important part of the practice, to sort of just like let everything go and to sort of focus on when you can let things go. And so the historic part is the material, and that's the fuzz and like the elements that you can see, but then you can let like any specific instance go.
Nice. So yeah, let's move to a couple of the audience questions. So let's have a look. One from Tom Nullpointer. I think that's Tom Betts. I've got a question. Would you use input controllers to alter values in your live coding? So rather than retyping numerical inputs, recompiling the line, have you explored using dials and sliders?
So I have used some MIDI pads for, not within Algebra, but like other emulator work and VDMX and other things I do further down the line. It's okay. For a while, I think I was a little more ideological that like about not being a knob twiddler, is like what we might say, to be like, is it really live coding if you're just standing there turning the knobs on the stage and you're not writing the code? And I think I was maybe a little more ideological about that before. Now I'm not, but Algebra doesn't take it.
Okay. So what else have we got? So one from Left Adjoint. Has anyone else read Computer as Crucible? It's about computers for creative exploring of mathematics, but the ideas are kind of broadly applicable. I haven't actually, so I can't really help with that one. But we'll have a look at that in the future. So another one from eMusic. What tools do you use? So we talked about the tools you make, but what tools do you use to make those tools?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So Algebra is made using Electron and ClojureScript. So, and then that's using basically web technologies at the bottom. So in that way, that's one set of tools that I'm using. And then for video processing, I use VDMX sometimes. And so that uses shaders and that has more of the continuous input, like Tom Null Pointer asked about, like using knobs and pieces. And something that's interesting that I forgot to say about that is a nice part about that approach is it makes things a lot more continuous. So it can also make the performance feel like it's evolving more smoothly. So that's like a pro of that. And then I also use some hardware synths, in particular a Fairlight CVI, which is a hardware synth from the 90s. So if you like imagine the most 90s or like late 80s, early MTV video you can think of, all of those effects. And then I also use the Signal Culture video synth emulators. So those you can use on your computer. And they have ones for like a frame buffer and other kinds of feedback. There's a data mosher one. And they really do a lot to make the possibilities of hardware synths available on people's computers. So like the frame buffer even has like a Jones frame buffer mode, which is one of the first frame buffers ever built. I feel like in the early 70s, I want to say. And so that's roughly the range. Oh, and I also have sometimes written my own video. I don't even know what to call it. Just web tools to chop videos up and move pixels around like in a canvas.
Cool. Yeah, so I guess you've been in the live coding scene a while. And I'm just wondering how you would recommend someone else got into this kind of thing. And so how did you get into live coding? How would you leave the ladder down for the next person? How would you kind of encourage the next person to come in?
That's a good question. And I think it's, well, depending on where you live, I think it's easier now. So in my case, Kate Sicchio was my professor at grad school. Mm-hmm. And she started Live Code NYC. And I started just going to meetings to see people and hang out. After I graduated, I was like, oh, I want to go see people I miss. And she talked me into playing with her by saying, like, you could make a tool to make visuals. She like sucked me in through the code part. And then I performed and was like, oh, wait, this is amazing. But now I think there's a lot more different groups. So if you're in New York or in London or in some other places, in Colombia and Mexico, right? There's different top lap nodes. And so people have meetups. And I will say that like live code people are some of the nicest people I've ever met. So you can totally show up at something and people will be really excited to talk to you. And if you're not in New York, I do know that Live Code NYC has a Discord now. So you can also go to their website and look it up, but I think you can join the Discord even if you're not in New York. And so that would be a way to like talk to people.
Yeah, there's a Discord for a general top lap Discord as well. I think if you search for all things live coding, you'll find a very long list of technologies and also communities to join and explore. What was I thinking of? I think there's something special though about making your own language, I think. And it's nice that there are still so many people jumping in and just trying to make their own language. I guess it's something about the feeling of making everything and really knowing everything that's going on. But then how do you feel, like, have other people used Algebra for making performances, and if so, how does that make you feel when you see that happen?
Yeah, so it's a little hard to use Algebra because Clojure scripts uses Clojure, which uses Java. So like step one of making it work is install Java, which is a big step one.
Okay.
But I've had one person that I know definitely used it. She performed, and I saw her show here in Berlin, and I thought that
Yeah.
was really interesting. I was a little bit worried beforehand that what was characteristic about my work was down to the limits of the system that I made, right? That like I made work that looks the way it looks because that's what the system can make. And so I was
Mm,
like really worried I was going to go and it was going to look just like what I made. And I was going to be like, oh, I'm just, my only skill is the system. Like I didn't actually make this art. And I went and it was totally different than what I would do. And it
nice.
was very satisfying.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, I think. Yeah, I recognise that as well. I think there's a point where you're not quite ready for the people to jump in, but because when you're making something new, you don't know what it's going to be yet, and you want to be the person who explores that. But when you know what it is that you've made, I think that's a nice point where you share it and see what other people do with it. Um,
And there's a lot of responsibility, I think, to making a tool for other people. Like, so like Algebra is on GitHub, and people are more than welcome to, copy it and do whatever they want with it. But at the same time, I put up fairly upfront that like I don't promise it's going to work,
yeah,
and I don't, and I don't promise it's going to stay the same. Because I think it's like a really big responsibility, like with Hydra and Olivia, and I know like you doing title cycles, like there's so much work into like building a community and keeping things working for everyone. That's like so much effort and isn't the art part. And for me, I was like, I only have so many hours in the day and I'm not willing to do this because I think if you're going to do it, you should do it well.
yeah,
And that takes a lot of time.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Sometimes you can find situations where you can get paid for that stuff as well. So
I've heard that.
yeah. um, yeah, I guess it'd be nice to come back to the idea of pattern, as this is called the kind of algorithmic pattern um, series. Do you kind of see an affinity with other pattern based activities? Like if computers didn't exist tomorrow, would you carry on making the same kind of work through another means, do you think? I suppose you've already said the answer. I would pick out your analog video synthesizer. but do you see, like, when you're working with the Fairlight, was it the Fairlight? Do you feel the same, that you're exploring the same, you're scratching the same itches? Is there commonality?
I do, yeah. So I think, in the Fairlight, um, I like using the effects also in weird ways to sort of make it a little bit more abstract. And then to make the abstraction approachable, I think the pattern and the repetition is very important, for people to understand what's going on, even. So we talked a little bit before about repetition, but like
Mm.
the complexity is apprehensible because it's repeated to you. Like,
Right.
I know what's going to happen in every frame because I wrote it, but the audience doesn't know that. But I think I would, and so with the Fairlight, I do think a lot about repetition and that creating another layer of the piece, right? There's the image by image part, which I always want to be like, oh, this one frame was great. And then you stop it and it's never as good as you thought it was because what made it good was its context.
Mm.
Um, and so, but if there was no video art at all, I would still make pattern art. I think that what's interesting there, it's the like phenomenological approach where by layering different patterns, you can experience in the context of the aesthetics, but that's also the way that the world works, right? What's his name? Is it Henri Bergson? Who's written about like patterns in the world as like a phenomenological approach. And it's like the pattern of the season and the pattern of the truck backing up in your street
Yeah.
and the way that like these layers of patterns are the same and different and help you to understand the relationships in other corners of the world, because you're constantly looking at this relationship between different kinds of repetitions. And like that's sort of what you live in the middle of.
Oh, that's a lovely answer, and I think it makes me think about error as well, like the relationship between error and repetition. Like if you repeat an error, it's not an error anymore, but it's also a way of exploring these errors is by repeating them and changing it. But then if you make an error, it's okay because you'll just have to wait until the next repetition and then you can do it right, and then it's like you're erasing history because everything repeats. So yeah, the kind of balance between error and structure in a repeated experience, I think, is a really interesting one.
Yeah, we're kind of just in this weird world trying to figure our way out, I think. And the repetition is like how you start to understand where you are.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny that repetition is kind of like often in a pejorative sense and pattern as well. Like, oh, it's just repetitive music. But yeah, I think that's nonsense, obviously. But yeah, we should try and get through a couple more questions before the end. So one from Metazul. Do you do many archival pieces for display, like in a frame, or is it mostly ephemeral performance work? I'm sure I've seen some prints by you somewhere.
I have done some prints, and I have done some short films. So those are sort of more for display to me, although displaying time-based art is like a notoriously hard problem in fine art. So
Right. Okay.
I like, there's more and more now, there's different screens. There was Electric Objects, which was this like great screen. I think there's still an open source version of it that's called Open Frame. So people can display like loops in their home. Now I use I have an Infinite Objects that has like a short clip that I really like that you can just sort of like leave on your table, and I don't get bored of it. But that's a whole other repetition, right? That like I literally stared a minute and 30-second clip multiple times a day, and I have not gotten sick of it after like 2 years. So.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, one more question from Left Joint again. Is there an algebra to the patterns in your systems? Ways they combine or compose in a formal way?
There's probably formalists out there who could describe it, but for me, it's definitely more intuitive.
Uh-huh. Okay. So it just happens through the construction of your code that things get combined.
Yeah. When we were talking before, you mentioned about, forget what it was, improvising, being willing to make errors as opposed to going in and distinctly saying, I'm going to make this thing. And I always have a fantasy of being so good at my tools that I could say like, oh yes, this is how these compose. And I can sit down and put all of these pieces together. And it never happens. Like I'm not that person, even though like I always wish I could be like able to describe things. So I think there probably is an algebra, but I couldn't describe it. The closest I think I've gotten was once I was like, sometimes I get frustrated and I'm like, why are there only 8 good shapes or like 6 good colors? That like you like keep working with something enough that you feel like you've seen every end of your system and there's nothing new. And I did sit down and list all of the different ranges that I could consider that I work with. And I multiplied them together and there was something like 13 million combinations. And I was like, okay, Sarah, stop whining. Like you have not reached the end. You can just keep going.
Yeah, it's great, isn't it? Combination explosions. You don't need many things to explore before you run out of time
Yeah, exactly.
in the universe. Oh, well, thanks so much. This has been a really lovely discussion. I think what's interesting for me about live coding, we've talked about computer programming a lot, but I think live coding is becoming its kind of own thing. It's sort of diverging from computer programming, and it's so nice seeing these tools, how they're evolving around not only the tools themselves, but ways of using them, cultures around them, and connecting with ancient practices like we've been talking about. All these patterny things which we'd be happily carrying on with if the electricity switched off tomorrow. Hopefully it won't.
Yeah, I definitely think conical would be on my list. I thought that was so cool, how it all came together last week. So
Yeah, I really recommend Conical. It's amazing. Cool. Right. Well, thanks very much. The next and final talk will be on juggling. I don't know if you'll be around for that, but Sarah, but that should be a nice one. Please sign up for that because the numbers will decide how we approach the talk. But for now, we'll say goodbye and see you at the next one. Take care, everyone. Thanks, Sarah.
thanks, everyone. Thanks, Alex.